Deep beneath the azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea lies one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. 3,000 years ago, the clash of bronze weapons and the creak of wooden ships echoed across these same waves as two ancient powers collided in what may have been the world's first recorded naval battles. This is the story of the Hittite Empire's desperate struggle for control of a distant island kingdom, a tale of copper, conquest, and the final gasps of the Bronze Age world. In the 13th century before Christ, as pharaohs ruled Egypt and Homer's heroes fought at Troy, a series of epic sea battles unfolded that would determine the fate of Cyprus and mark the beginning of the end for one of antiquity's greatest empires. The Hittites, masters of iron and chariots, found themselves forced to become sailors. Their enemy was Alashiya, a mysterious island kingdom whose very identity puzzled scholars for centuries. These weren't mere skirmishes between fishing boats. These were full-scale naval campaigns involving fleets of warships, amphibious assaults, and battles that raged both on the waves and on distant shores. Yet despite their monumental significance, these conflicts remain shrouded in mystery, known to us only through fragmentary inscriptions and archaeological whispers. What drove the mighty Hittite Empire to risk everything in these perilous waters? Why did they launch 3 separate invasions against a distant island? And what secrets lie buried in the ruins of Alashiya's lost cities? The answers reveal a world on the brink of collapse, where desperate kings fought not just for glory, but for survival itself. The story begins not in the Mediterranean, but in the mountain strongholds of Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire stretched across modern-day Turkey like a Bronze Age colossus. By 1400 BC, Hittite kings had built one of the world's first great empires, their armies crushing enemies from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Their capital at Hattusa boasted massive stone walls and elaborate palaces, while their diplomatic archives reveal a sophisticated network of treaties, alliances, and tribute that bound dozens of vassal states to their will. Yet for all their continental power, the Hittites faced a growing problem. Pirates and raiders terrorized their southern coasts, disrupting the vital trade routes that brought wealth flowing into their treasury. Worse still, these sea-borne marauders seemed to operate from a mysterious island kingdom that lay tantalizingly beyond Hittite reach. The merchants called it Alashiya, and its copper made it one of the richest realms in the Mediterranean. But where exactly was Alashiya? For generations, scholars debated this question with the passion of treasure hunters. Some placed it in Syria, others in southern Turkey. The breakthrough came only in 2003, when scientists analyzed clay tablets from the ancient diplomatic archives. Using sophisticated chemical analysis, they compared the clay composition to known sources across the eastern Mediterranean. The results were definitive. The tablets had been made from Cypriot clay. Alashiya was Cyprus. This revelation transformed our understanding of Bronze Age politics. Cyprus wasn't just another island. It was the beating heart of the ancient world's economy. The Troodos Mountains held some of the richest copper deposits on Earth, and in an age where bronze weapons and tools determined the fate of empires, control of Cyprus meant control of civilization's most precious resource. The kingdom of Alashiya had grown rich beyond measure from this copper monopoly. Their merchants sailed to every corner of the Mediterranean, trading ingots of gleaming metal for gold, silver, ivory, and exotic goods. Egyptian pharaohs addressed the Alashiyan king as their brother, acknowledging him as an equal despite his kingdom's modest size. This wasn't mere diplomacy, it was recognition of economic reality. Without Cypriot copper, the great powers of the Bronze Age would have been reduced to wielding stone tools like their ancestors. Yet Alashiya remained an enigma. Unlike the massive palaces of Egypt or the fortified citadels of Mycenae, Cyprus showed little evidence of centralized royal power. The island's Bronze Age settlements were modest affairs, more trading posts than imperial capitals. Some scholars believe Alashiya was actually a confederation of independent city-states, united only by their shared control of the copper trade. Others argue for a more centralized kingdom, perhaps with its capital shifting between coastal ports and inland mining centers. What's certain is that by 1300 BC, Alashiya had become a target. The Hittite king Arnuwanda I had already laid claim to the island, though his control remained theoretical. When one of his vassals, A troublesome warlord named Maduwata raided Cypriot settlements. Ar-Nuwanda was furious. The king's angry letter survives in the Hittite archives, revealing both his territorial ambitions and his frustration at being unable to enforce them. The problem was distance. Cyprus lay over 200 miles from the nearest Hittite port, separated by some of the Mediterranean's most treacherous waters. The Hittites were masters of land warfare, their bronze-armored charioteers and disciplined infantry unmatched in open battle. But the sea was alien territory, a realm where their traditional advantages meant nothing. As the 13th century progressed, the situation grew more desperate. New threats emerged from the west as mysterious groups of raiders, later known as the Sea Peoples, began their devastating march along the Mediterranean coast. These weren't ordinary pirates, but organized military forces capable of overwhelming entire kingdoms. They moved by sea, striking coastal cities before vanishing back into the waves, and their ultimate destination seemed to be the rich lands of Egypt and the Levant. Cyprus found itself caught in the crossfire. Alashiyan ships reported increasing attacks by Lukka raiders, fierce warriors from the rugged coast of Lycia, who served as both pirates and mercenaries. These assaults disrupted copper production and threatened the trade routes that were Cyprus's lifeline. Worse still, there were rumors that some of these raiders had established permanent bases on the island, transforming from temporary threats into occupying forces. For the Hittites, watching from their Anatolian strongholds, the implications were terrifying. If the Sea Peoples gained control of Cyprus, they would command both the island's copper wealth and its strategic position at the heart of Mediterranean shipping lanes. From Cypriot harbors, they could strike at will against Hittite coastal cities, cutting off the empire's access to Egyptian grain and African gold. The thought of such a catastrophe finally forced the Hittites to contemplate the unthinkable. They would have to become a naval power. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Throughout the late 14th and 13th centuries, the Hittites gradually built up their maritime capabilities. They established naval bases at key ports like Ugarit and Tarsus, turning these trading centers into military strongholds. Skilled shipwrights from across the empire were summoned to construct vessels capable of both transport and combat. Coastal cities were fortified against seaborne attack, while networks of signal fires and messenger systems provided early warning of approaching threats. Most importantly, the Hittites began to forge alliances with established naval powers. The kingdom of Ugarit, with its long tradition of seafaring and its powerful fleet of merchant vessels, became a crucial partner. Some historians believe that when the Hittites finally launched their assault on Cyprus, they did so using Ugaritic ships and sailors, transforming merchants into warriors through the promise of plunder and the threat of punishment. By 1275 BC, the stage was set for confrontation. The Hittite Empire, under pressure from multiple directions, had decided that Cyprus must be brought under direct control. The wealth of Alashiya would fund their wars, while the island's strategic position would anchor their defense against the growing chaos in the Mediterranean. 3 times they would launch their fleets against the mysterious kingdom, and 3 times the outcome would shake the foundations of the ancient world. The first of these campaigns remains the most mysterious, known to us only through fragmentary references in later inscriptions. What's clear is that it marked a new chapter in ancient warfare, the moment when land-based empires finally ventured onto the wine-dark sea in pursuit of their ambitions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the harbor at Ugarit, as the greatest naval expedition in Hittite history prepared to set sail. Bronze gleamed on spear points and shield rims, while the air filled with the creak of rope and timber. War galleys bobbed at anchor, their painted eyes staring eastward toward the horizon where Cyprus lay hidden beyond the curve of the earth. This was no mere raid or diplomatic mission. This was invasion. King Tudhaliya IV had spent months preparing for this moment. In the royal workshops of Hattusa, craftsmen had labored day and night forging weapons designed for naval combat, shorter spears that wouldn't catch in rigging, axes balanced for fighting on swaying decks, grappling hooks and boarding planks that could turn merchant vessels into instruments of war. The Hittite military machine, honed by centuries of continental conquest, was adapting to an entirely new realm of battle. The fleet that finally departed Ugarit was unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. Historians estimate it contained over 100 vessels, a mix of purpose-built warships and converted merchant galleys. The largest ships carried contingents of elite infantry, the cream of the Hittite army encased in bronze-scale armor and armed with the finest weapons the empire could produce. Smaller vessels served as scouts and supply ships, loaded with provisions for what might prove to be a lengthy campaign. At the head of this armada sailed the royal flagship, its purple sails marking it as the vessel of the great king himself. For the first time in Hittite history, their monarch would personally lead a seaborne expedition, a decision that revealed both the campaign's importance and the desperate stakes involved. If the invasion succeeded, Cyprus would become the eastern anchor of Hittite naval power. If it failed, the empire's enemies would know that even the mighty Hittites could be 3 days defeated on the waves. The journey to Cyprus took 3, during which many Hittite warriors experienced their first taste of life at sea. Ancient accounts speak of seasickness devastating the ranks, of proud soldiers reduced to helpless misery by the rolling waves. Yet as the familiar coastline of Anatolia faded behind them, and the unknown waters of the deep Mediterranean stretched ahead, even the most reluctant sailors must have felt a surge of anticipation. They were making history with every stroke of the oars. Cyprus appeared on the horizon like a dream made real. The island's mountains rose blue and hazy from the sea, their peaks crowned with the forests that would fuel Alashiya copper smelters. Coastal settlements dotted the shoreline, their white walls gleaming in the afternoon sunday. From the Hittite ships, it must have seemed like a land of milk and honey, ripe for conquest. But the Alashiyans had been watching the horizon too, and they were ready. The first battle erupted not on land, but on the water itself, as Alashiyan war galleys emerged from hidden coves to challenge the invaders. These weren't the lumbering merchant vessels the Hittites might have expected, but sleek fighting ships manned by crews who had spent their lives navigating Mediterranean storms and fighting off pirates. The Cypriots knew these waters intimately, every current and wind pattern, every hidden reef that could gut an unwary vessel. What followed was chaos incarnate. Ships rammed into each other with splintering crashes that echoed across the waves. Warriors leaped from vessel to vessel, fighting desperate duels on blood-slicked decks, while archers sent volleys of arrows whistling through the rigging above. The sea itself became a battlefield, littered with floating debris and the bodies of the fallen. The Hittites had trained for land warfare, where formation fighting and disciplined tactics could overcome superior numbers. But naval combat was different. A swirling melee where individual skill and seamanship mattered more than military doctrine. Many of their finest warriors found themselves helpless, reduced to clinging to the sides of their ships, while Cypriot sailors maneuvered with deadly precision around them. Yet slowly, inexorably, Hittite numbers began to tell. For every ship they lost, 2 more pressed forward to take its place. Their bronze weapons, forged in the workshops of the world's greatest military power, proved superior to Cypriot arms. Most crucially, their Ugaritic allies brought skills that matched those of their enemies, turning the naval battle into a more even contest. As the sun began to set on that first day of fighting, the Alashiyan fleet found itself overwhelmed. Ship after ship was captured or sent to the bottom, until the survivors were forced to retreat toward the island's harbors. The Hittites had won their first naval victory, but at a terrible cost. Nearly a quarter of their fleet had been damaged or destroyed, and hundreds of their finest warriors lay dead beneath the waves. The real test, however, was yet to come. As dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the Hittite survivors found themselves facing a new challenge. The easy part was over. Now they had to actually conquer Cyprus itself. The island that greeted them was not the helpless prize they had imagined. Alashiyan forces lined the beaches, their spears glinting like a forest of bronze thorns. Behind them, smoke rose from signal fires that would carry news of the invasion to every corner of the kingdom. The Hittites had achieved surprise in reaching Cyprus, but they had lost it in the naval battle. Now the entire island would be roused against them. The amphibious assault that followed became the stuff of legend. Hittite warriors waded ashore through chest-deep water, holding their shields above their heads as Cypriot arrows rained down around them. Those who reached the beach found themselves facing desperate defenders who fought with the fury of men protecting their homeland. The copper that had made Cyprus wealthy had also armed its people well, and Alashiyan bronze proved nearly as deadly as Hittite steel. For hours the battle raged along the shoreline, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Hittites possessed superior armor and training, but the Cypriots knew every stone and bush, every place where an ambush might be laid or a stand might be made. Just when it seemed the invasion might be thrown back into the sea, Hittite discipline finally prevailed. Formed into the tight phalanxes that had conquered half of Anatolia, they began to push inland, forcing the Alashiyan defenders back step by bloody step. By nightfall, the Hittites had established a precarious foothold on Cyprus. Their beachhead extended barely a mile inland, surrounded by hostile territory and cut off from easy resupply. Many of their ships had been damaged in the fighting, while others had been recalled to Ugarit to bring reinforcements. The surviving warriors huddled around their campfires, listening to the sound of Cypriot war drums echoing from the hills and wondering if they would live to see another dawn. What they had achieved, however, was unprecedented. For the first time in recorded history, a major land-based empire had successfully conducted an amphibious invasion against a distant island kingdom. The techniques they developed, the lessons they learned, would echo through military history for millennia to come. But their work was far from finished. Cyprus might be breached, but it was not yet conquered, and the Alashiyans were gathering their strength for a counterattack that would test Hittite resolve to its very limits. In the mountains above the invasion beaches, copper miners and shepherds were abandoning their peaceful occupations to take up arms. The wealth that had made their island a target would now fund its defense. The real battle for Cyprus was about to begin. The mountains of Cyprus had witnessed many things over the centuries. They had seen Bronze Age miners carve the first shafts into copper-rich veins. They had watched Alashiyan merchants grow wealthy beyond measure from the metal that flowed like rivers of gold to every corner of the Mediterranean. But they had never seen anything like the spectacle that now unfolded across their slopes. An entire island was transforming itself into a fortress. From every village and settlement, men streamed toward the coast carrying whatever weapons they could find. Farmers clutched bronze-tipped spears, hastily fashioned from pruning hooks. Miners emerged from their tunnels bearing pickaxes and hammers that could crush skulls as easily as ore. Even the shepherds descended from their highland pastures, their slings loaded with stones that could drop a charging warrior at 50 paces. This wasn't just an army mobilizing. It was an entire civilization rising in its own defense. The Alashiyan king, whose name has been lost to history, had made his choice. Rather than negotiate with the Hittite invaders or seek terms that might preserve his throne, he would fight. Messages raced across the island on swift horses, calling every able-bodied man to take up arms. The copper mines that had made Cyprus wealthy now served a different purpose, their forges working day and night to turn raw metal into weapons of war. Swords, spears, and arrowheads poured from the workshops in quantities that would have impressed even the weaponsmiths of Hattusa. But the Cypriots possessed advantages beyond mere numbers and determination. They knew their island intimately, every goat path and hidden spring, every cave where supplies could be cached and every ridge from which ambushes could be launched. The rugged terrain that had sheltered their ancestors from Egyptian raiders and Mycenaean pirates would now serve against the Hittite war machine. In these mountains, bronze-armored chariots would be useless. Here, the battle would be won by infantry, and the Alashiyans had faith in their ability to match any warrior who dared set foot on their sacred soil. The Hittites, meanwhile, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Their beachhead remained narrow and exposed, vulnerable to attack from 3 directions. Supply ships from Ugarit arrived sporadically, often forced to fight their way past Cypriot vessels that harassed them relentlessly. Food grew short, fresh water even shorter. Many of the invading warriors had never fought so far from home, and the psychological strain of being surrounded by enemies in an alien land began to take its toll. Worse still, disturbing reports filtered back from the mainland. Lukka raiders had struck the Hittite coast while the main fleet was away, burning coastal settlements and carrying off prisoners. The Sea Peoples, those mysterious maritime marauders, were reportedly massing in the Aegean for another wave of attacks. Every day the Hittites spent bogged down in Cyprus was another day their enemies could gather strength for assaults on the empire's heartland. The invasion that was meant to secure Hittite dominance was instead leaving them vulnerable. Yet retreat was unthinkable. Too much blood had been spilled, too much prestige invested. The great king himself had led this expedition, and to withdraw now would be to admit defeat before every vassal and rival in the known world. The psychological impact would be catastrophic, encouraging rebellions from Anatolia to Syria while emboldening the sea peoples to launch even bolder attacks. The Hittites were trapped by their own success, forced to continue a campaign that grew more costly with each passing day. The second phase of the invasion began at dawn on the fourth day. As Hittite forces pushed inland from their coastal stronghold, they moved in the disciplined formations that had conquered half of Anatolia, bronze shields locked together in walls of gleaming metal, while spearmen advanced behind their protection. At their head marched the royal guard, elite warriors whose bronze-scale armor had been polished to mirror brightness. These were the men who had stood beside their king in battles from Kadesh to Nihria, veterans whose courage had never been questioned. But as they climbed into the foothills, they entered a different world entirely. The olive groves and vineyards of the coastal plain gave way to rocky terrain, where every boulder might conceal an enemy archer. Ancient terraces, built by generations of Cypriot farmers, became natural fortifications. Stream beds turned into killing grounds where Alashiyan warriors could strike and vanish before the Hittites could respond. This wasn't the open warfare the invaders understood, but a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across mountainous terrain that favored the defender at every turn. The first serious engagement came at a narrow pass, where the coastal road wound between two steep ridges. Alashiyan forces had blocked the route with fallen trees and piled stones, creating a barrier that channeled the Hittite advance into a deadly funnel. When the leading companies tried to clear the obstacles, arrows rained down from the heights above. Warriors who had faced Egyptian chariots and Assyrian cavalry found themselves pinned down by shepherds and copper miners who had learned their archery skills hunting wild boar in these same mountains. For hours the battle raged, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Hittites possessed superior armor and weapons, but the Cypriots held the high ground and knew every fold in the terrain. Just when it seemed the pass might be forced, Alashiyan reinforcements appeared on the Hittite flanks, threatening to surround the entire vanguard. Only a desperate fighting withdrawal saved the invaders from annihilation, and they fell back to their beachhead with heavy losses and nothing to show for their effort. The failure at the pass marked a turning point in the campaign. What had begun as a confident invasion was degenerating into a brutal war of attrition. The Hittites found themselves fighting not just the Alashiyan army, but the island itself. Every village they approached was abandoned. Its inhabitants vanished into the mountains along with their livestock and supplies. Wells were poisoned, bridges destroyed, crops burned in the fields. The Cypriots were implementing a scorched-earth strategy that would have impressed even Hannibal, turning their own homeland into a weapon against the invaders. As the days turned into weeks, the true cost of the campaign began to emerge. Casualty reports painted a grim picture of an army slowly bleeding itself white against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Disease spread through the crowded camps, claiming warriors who had survived the initial assault only to succumb to fever and dysentery. Morale plummeted as veterans began to question whether any prize, even the copper wealth of Cyprus, was worth such suffering. Yet still the Hittites pressed on, driven by pride and the knowledge that retreat would be even more costly than continued advance. They adapted their tactics, breaking up into smaller units that could navigate the difficult terrain more effectively. They learned to fight like mountain guerrillas themselves, abandoning their heavy bronze armor for leather and cloth that allowed greater mobility. Most importantly, they began to understand their enemy, recognizing that the Alashiyans were not the simple island folk they had expected, but sophisticated warriors who combined Mediterranean seamanship with highland fighting skills. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arose not from military genius but from simple treachery. A Cypriot noble, perhaps motivated by promises of gold or threats against his family, revealed the location of a hidden path that led through the mountains to the island's interior. The route was treacherous, barely wide enough for single-file passage, but it offered something the Hittites desperately needed, a way to bypass the defensive lines that had stalled their advance for weeks. Under cover of darkness, a select force of the most experienced warriors began the dangerous ascent. They climbed through the night, guided only by their treacherous ally and the faint gleam of stars on polished bronze. Below them, Alashiyan campfires twinkled like fallen constellations, marking defensive positions that would soon be outflanked. By dawn, they had achieved what weeks of frontal assault had failed to accomplish, penetrating deep into the Cypriot heartland. The mystery of the Hittite sea battles against Alashiya fades into the mists of time, yet their legacy echoes across 3 millennia. These forgotten warriors pioneered naval warfare, transformed empires into maritime powers, and fought desperately for copper that would determine civilization's fate. Their story reminds us that beneath every legend lies human ambition, courage, and the eternal struggle for survival in a world where only the strongest endure.